brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش بالنصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجند العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرنا. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايد صدرنا. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
واسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to The World Tonight. It is 8 in the evening of the 9th of January 2024. And today we'll be having a focus for the program that is all about Germany and the escalating crisis there, manifested in a growing strike wave, including actions by farmers today, and with strikes coming up on Deutsche Bahn and unrest everywhere. The centre of the EU and the ruling class therein are facing up to a lot of trouble, and it is a series of antagonisms exploding into the open that have really been there since at least German reunification, and have been suppressed for a long time and are now bursting out. And we're going to be exploring a little bit about that in the next hour or so. But until we get along to that, we must greet those who are in the chat. So it's President Jesus, who's with us all the way from California, who says that Gavin Newsom sends his regards. Gavin Newsom looks like the kind of man who harvests stem cells from migrant children whilst claiming to care for them. The genuine American psycho of the presidential race, potentially. I saw a story the other day that some of the big guys in the Democratic Party have finally woken up to the fact that Biden and Harris are a losing combination. And I saw that some of the tipsters from, I believe it was Morgan Stanley, have been saying that Biden's likely to drop out, who presumably are men with their ears to the ground as to what the genuine movers and shakers in the ruling class are saying. Bear in mind, the Democratic Party is simply a private company owned by various elements in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, as is the Republican Party. So presumably somebody has made the decision that old Joe ain't going to cut it anymore. Apparently, the rumor is he's going to drop out after Super Tuesday, which is where you get, I don't know, is it Americans in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, is it about a dozen primaries for taking place in one day? That he might drop out after that. Now, if the Democrats have got any brains, they'll drop him like a hot potato. Unfortunately, the lead contender is the American psycho himself from California, a man who is spontaneously creepy and out of touch, and a genuinely disturbing figure, possibly even less human than Biden. So not exactly the man you want going up against Trump, who, if nothing else, actually comes across as a human being and actually quite a funny guy. Horrendous in many respects, but at least he's entertaining. Morning, comrade, says Banana Bender. The AFD is winning the polls in every East German constituency. Very important point, and I'm going to begin on that in just a moment. Good evening to Carmo out there on the Wirral, and Philbin all the way from Rhode Island, USA, and Rob, who says good afternoon from Southern Yorkshire. Bean says she's chuffed to little mint balls to be here. That is a very Yorkshire saying. I'm from the other side of the Pennines myself, originally from northern Derbyshire, and I think the most common saying there is Bayek. So, good afternoon to Arnold, or should I say good evening to Arnold, because he's down there in Bridlington. Not Enough Manner says, good evening, intro music slaps. Glad you enjoy the songs of a stirring and patriotic nature, but patriotic in the right sense, in that they're all from socialist states or about socialist states. Good evening to Peter, joining us from perfidious Albion itself. So, let's begin then, jumping off the comment that Banana Bender's made in the discussion group there, which is that the AFD, the Alternative for Deutschland, are winning in the polls in every East German constituency. And this gives us a good way into the discussion tonight, because what I want to say to you is that, of course, you're going to hear a lot, judging from the alternative media spaces I've been listening to over the past few hours, about the crisis in Germany, about what has caused it. And the case I want to make is that this is a manifestation of a much, much bigger crisis facing German imperialism. And by the way, we have later this week interviews coming up with some German comrades who will be able to give us a much more detailed breakdown of what's going on inside Germany. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. So, what has happened with regard to the rise of the AFD is actually similar to other processes that have gone on in the post Cold War era after the implosion and the counter-revolution that swept across Eastern and Central Europe and the USSR. What happened is, of course, that the implosion through treachery and counter-revolutionary elements being far too present in all of the ruling parties, for reasons I've gone into before, but we can pick that up in questions later if anybody wants to, is of course that there is a complete collapse of the people's democracies and the socialist system by the end of 1991, beginning of 1992. So that's 32 years now, since you can say that 92 is the definitive cutoff point. So, in 32 years, what has happened, politically speaking, in Eastern Germany? Let's take that as an example. You get initially a rise of a successor organization to the old SED, Sozialistische Einheitspartei, Socialist Unity Party, that was the ruling party in the DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republika, and the PDS, Party for Democratic Socialism, wins a lot of seats in the old East Germany. The East German working class turns out and votes for the PDS. The PDS joins up with a rogue faction of the SPD, led by Oskar Lafontaine, who'd been a finance minister and a very senior member of the SPD for many years. He broke away and formed I believe the acronym was WASG. I'm not going to try and remember all the German words for that, but he broke away through a dispute with Gerhard Schröder, the Chancellor. Lafontaine had originally been finance minister and had been easily probably the more senior man in the SPD, even than Schröder himself. And he breaks away in the late 90s to form the WASG, which has some popularity in Western Germany. The two come together to form Die Linke. And what I would say to you is that the rise of the AFD isn't just about, of course, its roots are in the crisis of German imperialism, but its political popularity is down to the failure, the catastrophic failure of the German left, not just over the last 10 years or 20 years, but since, I don't want to call it reunification, since the counter-revolution and the forcible occupation of the East and the destruction of the industries of the East, which is where this story really begins. Because the planned economy and the state-owned industries were either sold off if they were profitable or just closed down over the course of the 1990s. And in many cases, they weren't replaced with anything. You got a very high level of unemployment across Eastern Germany, what had been the DDR, all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s. And what proved to be the case, as it did everywhere, was that the counter-revolutions and the takeover of the former socialist bloc countries by capitalist forces, capitalist restoration, what did it lead to? It led overall to a deterioration of life. And this happened first in the east of Germany, where people were voting for the PDS and then Die Linke for many, many years. But the two of them, with the success of being Die Linke to the PDS, failed to mobilize the working class in any significant way. They failed to take advantage of their electoral breakthroughs to sink deep roots into the working class. They failed to make any lasting connection with the working class. They failed to mobilize the working class in any significant way to defend against the relentless attacks that came from the Berlin government. All they did was seek coalitions with the very party that was often carrying out those attacks, that is the SPD. So the situation in the East was that the reunification only brought unemployment, insecurity, and poverty, and a collapse into greater degrees of drug addiction and other social problems exploding. So not only was there a counter-revolution in the early 90s, it was followed by the working class, and not just in Eastern Germany, but also in Poland, also in Hungary, also in Bulgaria, all voting for the successor organizations of the communist parties. If this story sounds familiar, this happened in Ukraine as well, and it happened in Russia. In Russia, the vote was openly and nakedly rigged against the communists, who, as I've said before, did nothing about it. Same was true in Ukraine. So the successor organizations to the old communist parties or the ruling parties of the old Eastern Bloc were elected in the majority of the old socialist and people's states and people's democracies. What did they do? All of them surrendered to the diktats of, well, German imperialism and American imperialism. All of them surrendered, completely indulged in a privatization fest, indulged in a mass of destruction of the old industries. They were replaced by some investment from German imperialism in the various different Eastern European states. But of course, you got a collapse in living standards. Polish capitalism did slightly better because it had slightly more assistance from American imperialism, who wanted to make it a bit of a showcase for capitalist restoration. But overall, like the level of poverty in the working class in Eastern Germany increased, the level of insecurity increased, and in countries in Eastern Europe, of course, what happened was that they used migration inside the EU when they were able to join the European Union in 2004, and even before that, getting relatively easy access to visas. They were able to send large elements of the working class across the rest of Europe to work in service sector jobs, often in everywhere from, of course, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal to a degree, but especially Britain. And so the working class who was sent overseas, and a lot of them were anyway, and you get, again, look at what has happened in all of these countries. You get a collapsing birth rate as life becomes more expensive, and in a, what you might call a spiritual sense, has less purpose to it. So capitalist restoration breeds what? It breeds overall a sense of atomization and hopelessness, which is what has taken hold in Eastern Germany. But if you listen to the interviews that I did back when we were an audio-only podcast with a guy called Michael Burkhardt, who I tried to get back on, but he stopped responding to me. Maybe I said something that offended him. But we have got two very excellent German comrades coming on later this week. So keep an eye out for that. So the AfD and their rise should not be a surprise, because where you get these right-wing organizations coming along and making inroads into working class areas, why is it? It's because of left-wing failure. Not just a successful counter-revolution, but of course the working class voting, as they were told to, for the left alternative, the successor organizations to the old ruling parties, all the way across Eastern Europe. And what do? In the case of Germany, they've proved to be very ineffectual. Yes, they don't get into government, but very ineffectual in terms of actually pursuing any class-based program, either through the political system, which would have been very hard, or through other means. And in the rest of Eastern Europe, most of them just completely capitulated and embraced the ruinous processes that the restoration of capitalism put in place. And as Irish Partisan says in the chat, Belarus is unique in that you have this sort of, I think Irish Partisan, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's correct to describe Belarus as kind of the system is a bit of a coalition between Lukashenko and his sort of progressive Bonapartism. On one hand, you get a certain influence within that a kind of coalition with the Belarusian communists and the Belarusian version of the Liberal Democrats, Zhirinovsky's boys. And I think Belarus is kind of a coalition between Lukashenko in the middle, the Belarusian official Communist Party, the successor organization to the old CPSU, and the Liberal Democratic Party of Belarus on the other, on the sort of patriotic right, you might call it. And they are, Irish Partisan is right, they are the only ones who, the only nation who in the old Eastern Bloc who successfully retained large elements of the old system. By no means perfect. I mean, there's plenty to criticize that system for. There's plenty to criticize the rule of Lukashenko for. But none of that criticism is expressed by the Tymoshenko and the Washington puppets that she leads, badly, as it turns out. They are just looking to turn Belarus into another version of Ukraine. So again, the AFD's rise should not be a surprise. It's the whole nature of the way in which a class struggle unfolds is that when class struggle fails and hopelessness pervades, then the petty bourgeois right are the ones who can step in. And I say petty bourgeois right because the so-called populist forces are, of course, drawn from the petty bourgeoisie a lot of the time. They have some elements of support within the bourgeois, but not a majority by any means. In fact, a decidedly small minority, it would seem, judging by the response of the German state to the AFD. Now, if you recall one of the discussions I had with Kit Clarenberg last year, he was talking about, of course, the very dodgy so-called coup plot done by these bizarre collection of German monarchists who the German government alleged were planning some sort of seizure of power. Now, I haven't kept up with how that case has developed, but it seemed like the kind of thing that the FBI does in the United States, which is stick a bunch of agents into a tiny organization or create an organization, then get some disillusioned or disturbed people in there and poke them, metaphorically, and say, hey, patriots, want to do some terrorism? Then arrest them. So it's seems like that the German government has been up to similar tricks to the FBI in that sense. And if you look at the coverage of the German farmers' blockade and protest today and previous protests as well, because this is an issue that's been running on for quite some time. The coverage from like the BBC is hilarious. It's all conducted in this hysterical tone of the strengthening far right. He's on the march. Adolf himself has risen from the grave and is leading some lederhosen-wearing Bavarian farmers to Berlin to stage a new beer hall putsch or something like that. But the reality of this is, of course, that this is the German farmers' movement is drawing upon similar issues that the Netherlands farmers' movement did, that the French farmers' movements have done for many years. And also you've seen protests from Italian farmers as well. And it all revolves around a similar problem, which is that the protest movements aren't led by like shareholders of agribusiness. They're led by the smaller farmers, what you would call like the agricultural petty bourgeoisie, those who are small to medium-sized landowners who often have very, very thin profit margins, who usually produce like a couple of specialist items or who are in a longer supply chain. And the protest in Germany, the nominal cause of it is the cuts to diesel subsidies. And the background, of course, is that, of course, overall, energy prices in Germany jumped by 20% across the last year, 2023. So you have escalating cost crisis for farmers in Germany, Netherlands, France, and a lot of the rest of Europe. Now, agribusiness, of course, and the massive landowners can more easily take that hit. And one of the things you notice with all these protests breaking out is that it's the medium-sized or small farmer who is a level below, of course, agribusiness and the massive landowners, who is getting squeezed. And this is, of course, if you're at all versed in Marxism, you know why this is. Because, as Marx pointed out as early as 1848, the petty bourgeois, whether he is agricultural or urban, is a middle layer. And this is who a lot of these farmers are. They are a middle layer between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And they are constantly sandwiched between the two. And they look down and see the proletariat and fear being reduced to their level. And they look up and they look with envy and disgust and hatred at the big bourgeoisie, the big agricultural companies. They always evoke the visceral loathing of farmers. I mean, I've known quite a few because I grew up in the countryside, and there was still a few rural petty bourgeois around there at the time, and they were all Tory voters, of course. I went to school with quite a few of their sons. It was a state school, but it was kind of a mixture between working class and petty bourgeois. So you got quite a few of the agricultural petty bourgeois kids going there. And even though they all voted Tory and all swore that Tony Blair, as it was at the time, was a communist, which is hysterical when you think about it. The petty bourgeois always have wild delusions. It's the nature of the class. But they all, if you'd go round, play football with somebody, and you'd hear their father ranting about the big guys, about the way that if they're dairy farmers, they can't make any profit or barely any profit selling milk to the big supermarket chains, who, of course, there's 4 or 5 monopoly chains in Britain. I think the situation's fairly similar across Europe, who have got control of their milk and dairy market, and they can basically name their price because they're in a cartel to the suppliers, and the small farmers barely make any money off it. And of course, all of these people continue to vote Conservative because, well, if you actually ask them why, they'd just rant and rave about how the Labour Party is communist, which is the mentality of these people. In Britain, certainly it's the case, and I'm having watched some interviews from small farmers in the Netherlands and and Germany. It's the similar mentality there. So this has been brewing for a while. There's also problems with the EU-inspired agricultural policies, which they've dressed up in green language, saying that farmers have to make a series of changes to the way that they produce dairy, the way that they produce beef, or raise the cows for it, because the cows are farting too much and it's causing global warming. Of course, I've read studies on that which say that that's bullshit. But of course, what happens is that they start fining farmers who don't change their production process, who don't implement regulation X, Y, and Z. And so what happens is that the regulatory burden that is real, that does fall on the smaller farmer, because their profit margins are actually quite small in many instances, does threaten to pitch them out of business completely. And so a lot of them, and this has been the case for many years in Britain, just sell up to the big landowners or to agribusiness. And what this has led to actually in Britain is a situation where agribusiness has bought up some of the small land of the small farmers who've gone out of business over the years. And there was a lot that were driven out of business 22 years ago by the Blair government's mishandling of a foot and mouth outbreak. And if anybody's on the discussion group tonight from Britain, you may remember what I am referring. It was a tremendously expensive disaster for a lot of rural communities, where the government dictated that the farmers had to kill entire herds of dairy cows. Now, of course, again, agribusiness can soak that up. They can take the loss a lot of the time. The smaller end farmers got fucked completely. And this is what led to, I think it was the election in 2001. You got one farmer trying to punch out the deputy prime minister and them having a brawl in the street. Quite amusing. The only notable incident from that election. So in everywhere you go, the same tendencies exist, which are, of course, the tendencies towards monopolization. And, of course, legislation towards agricultural production always, of course, favors agribusiness and the massive landowners. It doesn't favor the medium and small farmer. Now, this, of course, is played upon in bourgeois politics by like reactionaries who are funded by the bourgeoisie to go around and make sort of pseudo-populist points. This is very true in America. It happens here too, but I think in America it's the sort of high point of this about regulatory burden. You get a lot of, especially Republicans in the United States, claiming to speak for the small businessman and the small farmer, saying we've got to get out from under this regulatory burden. But of course, the regulatory burden that does hit the small and the medium producer is a regulatory burden which is just fine, doesn't really affect the monopolies at all. It barely touches agribusiness in terms of touching their profit margins. So what happens is that, of course, that the bourgeoisie causes a problem, and of course, the system of capitalism causes the middle layers in agriculture to get squeezed, causes their profit margins to get squeezed out by the competition from the big companies and the big landowners. And of course, then these people get annoyed, justifiably annoyed, and get manipulated by some right-wing politician or left-wing politician who comes along and claims to have a solution, which will, of course, only make the situation worse, because to actually mitigate the squeeze on the petty bourgeois would take an extensive state regulatory framework. Now, such a framework has, at certain points, existed partially across different European countries and has even had some support from the European Union. So there was always the scandal over, I remember like relatives of mine in the 90s moaning about the common agricultural policy and subsidies to French farmers, etc. Now that was because of the way that French capitalism specifically developed, the French petty bourgeois farmer actually had a good deal more political power for a lot longer than his equivalent did in Britain, because of the way that French industry and French capitalism developed in the 1840s and 50s and 60s in particular, where instead of the mass industrialization that you got in Britain, combined with relentless changes to land, which of course helped concentration of ownership and monopolization of the land in Britain, the squeezing out of the ruination of a lot of the small landowners and the gobbling up of their land by the larger ones. And so in Britain you got a combination of mass industrialization and a removal of any power from like the rural bourgeois, whereas in France you got, through the Napoleon III period in particular, you got a distorted and a derailed development of industry thanks to the damage of the Napoleonic Wars. You then get the Napoleon III period, where you get him as the first Bonapartist, true Bonapartist, leaning on a support base of financial capitalists, small farmers, and the peasantry. Whereas, of course, it meant that the big industry, the industrialists, were somewhat outside, not completely, of course, but less favoured in his support bloc than the rural petty bourgeois. So in France, you get a serious and much more powerful political bloc of petty bourgeois than you do in quite a lot of other European countries that lasted really until quite recently. It was always under attack, of course, always being squeezed by big capital. But the lingering after effects of the Napoleon III period lasted a long time into the 20th century. And you could see the outbreak of French farmers' protests. I remember it being a thing back in the very early 1990s, like it was subject to jokes in British media. And why was that? It's because it's in the early 1990s that the squeeze starts getting put on the rural petty bourgeois in France and elsewhere as well. But in France, their position had been the most protected for the longest time, so they really started objecting to the withdrawal of their relatively better off position. And this is where you get people like José Bové, if anybody remembers him. He's the French farmer who drove his agricultural digger into a McDonald's and trashed it. All very entertaining stuff. There was an organization called ATTAC, ATTAC, that was quite big in France that Bové led. There was quite a number of radical sort of left petty bourgeois farmers who were very active in the anti-globalization movement in France in the early 2000s. And why was that? It was because the attempt by the French government to increase so-called competition and of course cut subsidies to them was meaning that they were under, of course, increasing pressure in the market, and big agriculture was looking to move in, push them out of business, buy up their land, and get them off the land. And this, of course, triggered an enormous response from the French farmers' movement. And they remain a militant group to this day, even though, of course, they've been losing this battle for over 30 years now. And it's similar things are true, similar factors are in play in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany and Italy. So this lies at the heart here of what is going on in Europe, which is that the petty bourgeois farmer has survived as a more powerful political bloc in all of these countries than their equivalents in Britain did. Britain, as the oldest continually existing capitalist nation, went through a very long period of land reforms that really ran from the 11th century all the way through to the 19th century, which began with the mass dying out of a lot of landowners, with the visitation upon the shores of the Black Death, followed by the Peasants' Revolt, followed by land reforms starting to take hold, and then a certain period of time, a few centuries later, you had another wave of land reforms caused by the changes in how feudal households were regulated by Henry VII, and then you get the mass seizure of church land, and it's turning over to new, more capitalist owners by Henry VIII. So we've had land reform for a long time, which has pushed the position of the petty bourgeois farmer to the point where they have always been a lot weaker, and agricultural monopolization has always been a lot stronger here. The other side of that, though, is that even though we have a lot of concentration of ownership in land in Britain, we don't actually use in the most effective way, of course, the land that could be used for farming. So I've already said in previous broadcasts that we import over 40% of the food that is consumed in this country. A lot of agricultural land, or potential agricultural land in Britain, is turned over to the rich for various leisure pursuits. So going back to the German farmers' situation, now this, of course, the outbreak of protests amongst the petty bourgeois is becoming more and more common. It's the factor that defines the Trump phenomenon in the United States. There was a recent article saying that most of the people arrested on January the 6th, those who weren't FBI agents, by the way, were actually from... The article had this shocked tone. It was like respectable professions. Many of them were small businessmen. Some of them were architects. Some of them were doctors. Some of them were quite well-off lawyers. Why are these people, what you would call sort of petty bourgeois pillars of a community, why are these people suddenly getting arrested? Why are these people suddenly getting angry and militant? Well, it's because all the way across the imperialist nations, all of these people are feeling the pinch, sometimes for the first time in their lives. Now, the tendency amongst most of the left has been to say, well, fuck them. These people are all right-wing, they're all hideous, we don't want anything to do with them, which is a very stupid and short-sighted way of looking at things. What we have now developing in Germany with this farmers' protest, but across the rest of Europe too, Western Europe in particular, is the devastating impact of 30 plus years of a process of monopolization of capital, monopoly capital extending its power everywhere, so that even layers that were ardent supporters of capitalism, whose the members of these classes voted for very reactionary or just plain old reactionary parties, who are typical, there are typical cases of being people who are very anti-communist, but they're all getting squeezed now. The system is putting the screws on them, and this is why all these protests are breaking out. And as communists, what we should be doing is orientating ourselves in such a way as to be able to at least talk to these people. Now, you get some people who say, we're going to collectivize the land anyway under communism, so why not just have the capitalists do it for us, and we should celebrate the collectivization process. That, again, is a dull-witted and mechanistic way of thinking. The opportunity that outbreaks of protest by the petty bourgeois provides is an opportunity of fracturing the bourgeois support blocks that they have, not just for their political parties, but as objects which support structures of support for bourgeois rule. The petty bourgeois, in terms of the small businessman, the small farmer, have been pillars of support for German reactionary parties. And by reactionary parties, I mean parties like the CDU, CSU, or the Gaullists in France. And the fact that they are now not just raging against these parties. I know that it's an SPD-led coalition in Germany right now, but I cannot see the CDU, CSU making that many changes in terms of the way they're putting the squeeze on the small and medium farmers, because this has been done. It's being justified by the German finance minister, this fucking clown called Christian Lindner, as being a budget-saving measure, because the German High Court ruled that, German Constitutional Court ruled that the government's budget deficit was unconstitutional, and they needed to make all these cuts to spending to make sure that they got back on budget again, because there is a constitutional clause basically to try and prevent overspending and prevent inflation in Germany. It doesn't work in terms of preventing price rises for the working class and indeed the petty bourgeois, of course, but it's a device like anything else under capitalism. It's a device that is going to be used to justify attacks on the working class. So the way in which this is going now in Germany is not going to change. If the CDU got into office tomorrow, I mean, first of all, the polls show that it wouldn't have much of a majority, or it may even have to get itself into a coalition with somebody, maybe even the AfD. And it's doubtful that they would change significantly the policies taken up by Scholz, because remember, Scholz was a part of the coalition with Merkel, as was the SPD, for years. There's really not that much difference between the SPD and CDU, CSU. So whatever, even if the farmers get their way and Scholz crumbles, I mean, there's rumours Scholz is on his way out anyway, and the CDU came in tomorrow, again, I don't think the approach would vary too much. Maybe they'd drop this diesel subsidy cut, but they'd be back for other things. The German deficit isn't going to change. The crisis in Germany, which has been coming for a long, long time, and has really been coming since reunification, isn't going to get any better. Deindustrialization in Germany in certain industries has been going on for quite a while. The Merkel period, as those interviews that we did back in the audio podcast days with Michael and Elena, way back when, 2 years ago now, show, the state of life in Germany has been getting worse for the working class for many years, and now the petty bourgeois is feeling the pinch. And the crisis is such that, again, the CDU isn't going to change that much. They're not going to stop, for instance, funneling weapons into Ukraine. That project's far too important, but precisely because, as I have talked about on numerous occasions on this channel, the way in which the European ruling classes, particularly the French and the Germans, are now looking at this is, well, now the system is in crisis. We are in desperate need of a regime change operation in Moscow. It's not going to happen, of course. Everything they have done has made Putin stronger, because these clowns didn't realize that they were the representatives of a chronically weak system anyway. They fooled themselves into thinking that they were something special, whereas in actual fact, the position of German capitalism has been deteriorating, I would argue, since reunification. And it was a position that they had built up, partially thanks to, in the Federal Republic days, very heavy American subsidies initially, and ultimately they went through the 1990s by looting and destroying, first of all, East Germany, and then being able to use the single currency to loot and destroy the economies of Eastern and Southern Europe. So the German ruling class have had their loot over the years, but of course now the crisis is here. They're turning on the German petty bourgeoisie and the German working class. So to go back to what I was saying, any communist now, in my view, should be trying to get along to these demonstrations, to at least talk to these farmers who are taking action. Yeah, a lot of them are going to be anti-communist. There's no getting around that. That's just the way this layer is at the moment. When you have a very weak proletariat, very inactive proletariat for many years, the main ideological influence on the petty bourgeois comes from the bourgeoisie, comes from the lower end of the bourgeoisie, the bitter, resentful, more petty nationalistic wing that's virulently anti-communist. And that's where the ideology that filters down into the what you might call the more reactionary sections of the petty bourgeois comes from. But we should still go to these protests nonetheless, and see if any of these farmers is prepared to have a reasonable discussion. And what should we say in these discussions, I hear you ask? Well, in my view, an opportunity is arising now to at least start talking to these petty bourgeois types, some of whom will be, perhaps, I don't know, but some of whom may even be millionaires. But being a millionaire these days doesn't actually buy you a lot in terms of political power. €1 million, £1 million, $1 million ain't what it used to be. So there is a chance to discuss with some of these people, and you look at some of the stuff that has been said by them in interviews and online, and they may well be open to the point. In fact, I remember one guy I spoke to who was some young farmer from Shropshire or somewhere when I was at an event years ago. It was about COVID, but we were talking about agricultural monopolization. And when it comes to talking about being anti-monopoly when it comes to the supermarket trade, or anti the monopoly exercised by agribusiness and the big landowners, they're all on board with that. Because, of course, why wouldn't they be? It's in their interests to oppose the power of the monopolies, and especially the power of the monopolies to dictate prices to them. And so there's a discussion to be had there, and a constructive discussion that should be engaged in regarding the power of the agricultural monopolies and the need to take action against them. So there's a chance to bring some of these people around if we can agree on things. And I think that being against the the power of the big landowners and the big supermarket chains is one way of doing that. Now, of course, this raises the question about, well, what should communists say when these people ask us about agricultural and land policies under communism? Now, I should stress that this is, of course, purely my own opinion and my own speculations as to how we could respond to this. Now, I would say that upon taking power in this theoretical workers' revolution that we're waging here, you can pretty soon establish, you can in this country, you can everywhere, I think, by looking at the land registry, who owns what. You can look at how much land is owned by the big landowners in this country, like the big aristocrats still own an awful lot of the productive land. Big business owns an awful lot of it. So the principal and primary target for nationalization of the land in the advanced, the imperialist countries. So you can apply this, I think, to the United States as well. Should be the land that is owned by agribusiness and the rich. So if you go down to some farmer's protest and say we should take all Bill Gates's land off him, a lot of them will probably, most of them, the overwhelming majority would probably agree with you, given how much productive land Bill Gates has bought up. Not just him, all kinds of other capitalists as well, not just individual capitalists either, but like people like BlackRock and the Vanguard Group. This is one of the positives of the way that these petty bourgeois protests have gone in Europe and in the United States, is that at least some of these protesters now recognize that the big monopolies are actually their enemy. That BlackRock, the Vanguard Group, and others are enemies of theirs. So that's a positive step forward. It can be distorted and sent in the wrong direction by all manner of demagogic opportunists, but it's something that gives communists the ability to actually talk to these people about that and say, okay, well, you think we're not interested, initially at least, we're not interested in nationalizing the land of the small farmer. What we are interested in is taking the land off the Wall Street finance houses and banks, off of the likes of Bill Gates, off of the likes of Monsanto. We are interested, and we are going to take that land that has already been collectivized in a capitalist sense, and we're going to turn that into state-sponsored collective farms. That's the way in which we're going to take it. The small farmer, and again, what constitutes a small farmer, of course, is open to debate to a degree. Each nation would have to make that decision through their own democratic process. But just in rhetorical terms, in terms of approaching people, what we could say is we're not interested in taking the land of the small farmers who are out here protesting. We are interested in making the country, referring now to a country like Britain, self-sufficient in agriculture again, which it was at one stage. We are interested in making the maximum usage of the agricultural resources that we have. Now, that means taking over the land of big business and the big landowners, and it means building a new system into which the small farmer in the initial stages can find a place and can turn, perhaps in the transitional period, a reasonable profit on buying and selling from the now set up state farms, perhaps. I am speculating here, but this is a potential conversation to be had. And what we would aim for overall is to make, again, as I said, maximum usage of the agricultural land to make our countries as self-sufficient in agriculture as possible. And we want to build the small farmers into a plan of production which they will and can, through the democratic system, play their part in putting together. They can represent their interests through a collective organization into the economic planning process, the same way many other collective organizations will do. And in this transitional period, in the initial period of a new state, a new workers' state being built, we can build an alliance between the petty bourgeoisie and the proletariat based on building a new democratic state. And that will, of course, lead to probably some interesting discussions if German or French or Belgian farmers are anything like British ones, but the developments in recent years have given us this opportunity to at least be able to open up that discussion with them, to at least be able to have a discussion with them about the fact that how the agricultural monopolies need to be taken down. And I wouldn't expect to win any of them over with one conversation, but if you've got a leaflet, if you've got some decent talking points you can talk to them about, if you can go down there and say, I as a communist, we as communists have absolutely no interest and are not going to come here and tell you to vote for the fucking Democrats or make excuses for them, or the Labour Party or the SPD, or, you know, whatever the fuck constitutes the French left these days. I believe it's Mélenchon and his motley crew. You know, we need a new system. We need to dismantle the monopolies and take the land out of the hands of the big landowners and agribusiness, and that should be a priority for us. Let's see if we can work together on achieving that. And the system, I think you could get a long way with some of these people by saying, look, the system cannot be reformed. We can't vote our way out of this. A lot of these people are coming to the realization that the parties, the reactionary parties that they've voted for, and maybe their parents voted for a long time, have basically just led them into disaster. A lot of the British farmers that I've known over the years know very well that the Conservative Party has been as disastrous for them and their position as the Labour Party has. The only reason they vote for it is because they hate the Labour Party so much, often for the wrong reasons. But again, it's a conversation to be had. And so this is the approach that we should be using here. We should be looking to exploit this opportunity to raise anti-monopolist demands with a section of the petty bourgeoisie who is becoming radicalized. And therefore, it's certainly something that communists, I think, should be engaging with. Might lead to a lot of frustration, might lead to you to having to spend 10 minutes to an hour dispelling myths about communism, but that's good. That's good. At least it's a start. So let's tackle some of the comments and questions that we've got here. Peter says, Walter Benjamin got this right. I think every rise of fascism bears witness to a failed socialist revolution or a counter-revolution. You are correct. Good afternoon to Martin over there in the US. Hello to Klavek. Yep. Belarus equals United Russia Party of Putin. All right, okay. Is that represented in? I'm telling you, is that Lukashenko's party in Belarus, Irish Partisan? If you could clarify, please. Peter says, monopoly capitalists hide behind Adam Smith's hidden hand mythology, but take great care to conceal their decision-making power. Concealed power imposed on the people generates paranoid discontent. Yes, particularly if it's power concealed behind an apparent democracy. So this is why you get a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of people believing in like Illuminati stuff, because it's a sort of Hall of Mirrors reflection of the truth. Like it's a partial truth, which is people know or feel that the politicians on the television that don't have any power or don't really decide anything. They feel that the print and broadcast media and internet media is full of shit and doesn't actually reflect reality. And that's a good start. But then, of course, what happens is that people make realizations, and again, without a communist party there and without a powerful working class movement, what happens is that often people who take the first couple of steps fall into different forms of like bourgeois ideology, because like these like strange conspiracist stuff, stuff about hidden cabals, like it's a sort of lower bourgeois and petty bourgeois piece of ideology that seeks to understand capitalism by locating like a hidden cabal of bad actors. Like it's not a class question, it's a question of a group of evil individuals who have distorted the system. This is the rhetoric you get a lot from libertarians in the United States, that's the kind of people I was talking about with Comrade Marius on the American Civil War discussion the other day, because a lot of these people don't want to admit or can't deal with the idea that it's capitalism itself which has done this. That my comrade Jyoti, in a discussion she had recently with Garland Nixon, which I would recommend you all watch if you haven't already, said that the people say deep state or permanent state or things like that, whereas in actual fact it's just the state. That's all it is. It's the bureaucratic state that grew up due to the rise of imperialism. That's what you're dealing with. It hasn't really changed all that much. Well, it's got more repressive over the years, but that's where its origins are. It's where its origins come from. So the idea of the deep state is just sort of a modern spin on a very old problem facing us. And so what communists can do, of course, is provide clarity on all of these things. You can say to people, yes, there are hidden groups of people making decisions. They're called capitalists, and they do it not in hollowed out volcano lairs or near-Earth orbit space stations. At least I don't think so. But they just do it in clubs. They do it in boardrooms. They do it in at dinners where they discuss the fact that there should be an interest rate raise or an interest rate cut with the governor of the Bank of England or the chairman of the Federal Reserve. It's just a standard dinner for them, and they can do it because there's not actually that many of them in the ruling class when it comes down to it. And they can, it's all just done behind closed doors. So the people who think that there's a hidden cabal aren't wrong in that decisions are taken in ways that are concealed, but this is just how capitalism does business. This is how it has always done business, or particularly since the working class got the vote. It's taken all of its decision making out of parliaments and out of council chambers and out of Congress and even out of the office of the President of the United States, and it all happens in small groups where capitalists come together with senior bureaucrats and say, oh, our priority is this, 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 and this, but you better tell the president to say that it's for this. And this is how power under capitalism is exercised. There's other things as well, such as the funding of think tanks and the purchase of media organizations such as Bezos buying the Washington Post. And that is more for the purposes, though, of persuading the petty bourgeois that the system's still operating in their favor, when of course it really isn't. But power is not explained to you in the way I've just explained it. Power is never explained properly, of course, by the bourgeois press. They have an interest in hiding the way that power or that class power actually operates in capitalist society. They'd actually rather people did listen to Alex Jones for, say, 24 hours a day. They'd much rather that you listen to that than pick up a book by Marx and actually start to understand how the system actually works. Right, where are we going? Right, Irish Partisan says, Estonian teachers also going on strike over pay. Well, the outbreak of class struggle in the Baltic states is a massive step forward. If we get more class struggle in the Baltic states, you'll see the Baltic reactionaries, I think, take another really stupid decision, which is that to distract people and to try and deflect away from class conflict, they'll probably try and whip up more anti-Russian sentiment, which will lead them closer to the big one, of course, which will be if they start attacking legally or illegally the Russian minorities in their countries, it's going to lead them inexorably towards, of course, potential conflict with the Russian Federation, which has now established a precedent which Russian communists and nationalists will point to. So if the Baltic reactionaries in desperation up the level of repression against the Russian minority, things might take a spin for the decidedly worse for the yapping dogs of the Baltic. Of course, the people who make these decisions will be on the plane over to exile in Washington before you can snap your fingers. Right, okay, where are we now? Peter says the discontent is justified. The paranoia deliberately manipulated to engender support for monopoly capital's jackboot wing. Social democracy's impotence drives fascist scapegoating and brutalism. I wouldn't say that social democracy is impotent. What I would say is that social democracy is now reformism without reforms. Reforms were only ever made possible by a strong domestic working class and an external revolutionary threat. Now the external revolutionary threat has gone. The ruling class sees no need for social democracy anymore in terms of its reform days. And so therefore, of course, social democracy offers absolutely nothing, which is why it's, of course, obsessed with petty bourgeois leftist obsessions such as gender ideology, various forms of like very dubious academic theories on race, that kind of shit. Because it offers absolutely nothing, and so it has to motivate its petty bourgeois base somehow. And so they've chosen like various forms of identity politics from time to time to indulge in. Of course, the working class just hates it all the more when it does that, because of course they recognize that this party used to provide some kind of alleviation for their condition. Now it just talks shit and delivers the same thing that the traditional right-wing party does. So their hatred, the working class's hatred for the old parties of social democracy is very justified. But they're not, unfortunately, they're not impotent. Labour Party isn't impotent. Labour Party will be used to deliver a more efficient attack on the working class. So I would dispute your usage of the term impotent there in that comment, Peter. But generally, I understand what you mean. Where are we now? Solidarity Comrade says muzzle paint. Aspects of some of this, says Philbin, in the USA over the years. The National Grange of Oliver H. Kelly, various farmers' orgs and populist movements of the 19th century. Yes, I've read about some of those. I should really do a program on it at some stage. Philbin follows up with saying, now bourgeois political platitudes every election to a few remaining family farms, or a more broad reference to the petty bourgeoisie, small businesses, reactionaries all, or nearly so. Todd says, thank you for the very informative background. Happy to do so. Good evening to Burke. Peter says, in the decay of the ruling class, is the decay of the ruling class driving them to manipulate the ideological superstructure frantically, only to find that it's material effects that drive true class consciousness even in the petty bourgeoisie? Well, what they're trying to do at the moment is they're trying to, I think the best way, I mean, the fact that the Germans are following the American playbook so religiously is interesting, because what the American ruling class tried to do was to essentially build their own sort of distorted, nightmarish version of an old united front against Donald Trump. That's what they tried to do, with everybody from George W. Bush to a man who should at the very least have spent the previous 20 years and the rest of his natural life in prison, to the DSA. This is the subject of the Time magazine article in April of 2021, in a broad front against the evil one, Donald Trump, and using openly bragging about using the state forces to crush his movement. Now, what that reflects, as we talked about in the episode on Trump, is the fact that the support basis for the established political organizations in America, in the United States, is decaying and declining. And you've got now even the lower end national, or even some of the regional state-based capitalists in the United States now feel like, or in fact, it's not a feeling, it's a fact, that they are frozen out of the political decision-making process, that they're getting squeezed by monopolization and the crisis of capitalism, that they're getting hit with increased expenses. And they, of course, to a certain degree, have turned to Trump in the United States or to the AfD in Germany There's not been a coherent political response to it in Britain yet, but I imagine one will follow. UKIP was a little bit of that 10 years ago. The Tories are starting to get a bit worried about Farage and Reform UK now. They seem to be going up in the polls. We'll deal with them in a future episode, but similar process going on. So now you've got it's quite fascinating that, and it's one of the reasons I've chosen to do a season on Gramsci, is because you're actually starting to see the blocks which the bourgeoisie has to put together to support its rule. Like, if it was just the bourgeoisie trying to justify its rule, well, they wouldn't be able to, because there's nowhere near enough of them. Under capitalism, they have to keep a significant section of the petty bourgeois and just enough of the working class bought into the system. Doesn't matter which party they're voting for. What you're seeing now, and I think this is what Trump really represented, and this is the danger that he represents. Not that he did much to actually affect American imperialism, but the fact that a section of the lower bourgeois and a big chunk of the petty bourgeois have gone with this guy who's very unpredictable and says all kinds of wild things, even if he doesn't do a great deal, even if he was fairly constrained in office. But the fact that he's going out there and like shooting his mouth off constantly, and the fact that the coalition that built the very solid Republican Party for generations was visibly starting to fracture, and that the chosen men of the ruling class, the people whose careers the ruling class had paid for, like Ted Cruz, like Marco Rubio, like Chris Christie, they were all just thrown out, just as Ron DeSantis has been cast aside, just as Nikki Haley will be cast aside, given that the anger that the petty bourgeois and lower capitalists actually feel now, coming from, of course, their deteriorating class position, their deteriorating financial situation, is starting to make the blocks that the American ruling class has put together fracture. They were able to reinforce the left side of that block by building an alliance against Trump. Now the right side of that is starting to crumble, and is going to crumble further as the pressure on these layers in the American class system gets more intense. So Trump is just the first. We can expect all kinds of weird and not so wonderful political formations to spin out of this layer in the United States. Now, hopefully, the American comrades can start to build more coherent national organizations, so that there is a response from communists to these sort of petty bourgeois eruptions that can at least have a discussion with these people. Hopefully so, because without that, then someone in the ruling class is going to join the dots up together about how to actually create a coherent fascist movement. And when we get to the serious crisis, which could seriously endanger American imperialism, then some of the biggest bourgeois will decide, well, it's time for us to get ourselves an Adolf. And we'd all better be ready for that. So yes, in answer to Peter's point, they are trying to solve this problem by state repression and manipulation of bourgeois ideology, by just screaming, right-wing conspiracy over and over again. They think that they can override people's material interests. Well, that might work for an election cycle, but it's not going to work long term, not at all. But look how deluded these people are. They actually thought that their sanctions would destroy the Russian economy. In actual fact, it set it back on the right track again, or partially the right track again. I've already read that. Yuan says the ruling class got the reserve army of labour from Eastern Germany. Yes, they did. And when that didn't work for them anymore, they got another reserve army of labour from Syria in the Middle East. That's why they let in those million people 9 years ago now. It wasn't Merkel being a humanitarian. It was the need for a new reserve army of labour that would work in non-union conditions. That's why they let all those people in. Peter enjoyed the conversations with Comrade Marius. Well, they were very, very good. It's always a good discussion with Comrade Marius when he comes on. Philbin asks, any chance these early polls showing AFD doing well ends up helping Die Linke? No. Shows the SPD has failed to stop reactionaries. Might they return to socialism? Is Die Linke a reliable proletarian party? No, it's not. It's a petty bourgeois disaster. In fact, it's my speculation, but I think that the German state itself has a hand in Die Linke, and that's part of the reason why it's a disaster. Now, will Wagenknecht's organization, Sarah Wagenknecht's organization, do any better? It's possible, but we'll have to see how it goes. I will ask the German comrades about that when they come on. Muzzlepaint says, Saturday, January the 13th, major march in Washington, D.C. on Gaza war. Yes, going to be covering that on Saturday. Irish Partisan says, newsflash, state of emergency declared in Ecuador, multiple explosions. Explosions in multiple cities. Right, well, I'll have to follow that up. Thanks for the notification, Irish Partisan. Muzzlepaint says, excellent opportunity for solidarity and conversation, Alex referenced today. Peter says, great point about social democracy's reformism without reforms due to absence of organised class threat to the bourgeoisie. Well, it took me a while to work that out, Peter, to be completely honest. It took me a while to make sense of social democracy properly. Good evening to Beiju down south there. Good evening to you, comrade. Muzzlepaint says, the DSA is a dangerous and distracting political gravity well. I know them well in the Baltimore, Philadelphia area. Yeah, I mean, with regard to the things like the DSA, it's a state operation. Some of the people inside there don't know it, but it's always been a state operation. From the earliest days when that twat Michael Harrington founded it, because it is, of course, organically connected to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is an organ of the American state. It's a state part. It's not an organ that's independent of the American state in any way. It's totally controlled by representatives appointed by the American bourgeois. It's organically linked to the bourgeois state, and the DSA is organically linked to that. The DSA is an operation of the American bourgeois. It's disguised, of course. Many of its members won't recognize it that way, but if you lay things out to people like that, I think it makes sense. It's a bourgeois operation. As Muzzlepaint says, it's a distraction operation. In terms of how to approach it, I mean, I was part of a distraction operation. I was part of essentially what I think in effect was a state-sponsored entity, a Trotskyite organization for years. I didn't know I was. I thought I was actually fighting the class war. I thought that people like me now were hopeless Stalinists. But again, we've got to have an approach to the ordinary member here in these parties who might be in it for the right reasons. So perhaps that's something to return to in the future. Only the far left can beat the far right, says Mallard. I know what sentiments you're expressing there, but I would put that differently. I would say only communists can beat fascists. And this applies also in the case of places like Ukraine. Only communists who have rediscovered, re-examined the legacies of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and others can hope to actually put fascism in the grave where it belongs. You can't fight, or you can't destroy fascism with forms of liberalism because these are both children of capitalism. And the liberals will run and hide behind fascism whenever the working class reaches a point of militancy which the bourgeois liberal finds unacceptable. And this is why ultimately, of course, I know that the Russian state says they're going to denazify Ukraine. Well, they're going to kill a lot of them, but they can't get rid of Nazism. They can't get rid of fascism because this is still a capitalist system. Only a return to communism in the states of the former Soviet Union is going to bury fascism, and only a return to communism which has learnt the bitter lessons of the 20th century, will bury fascism once and for all. Right. Philbin says, is there an extant successor organisation to the SED that is worthwhile to proletarians in Germany? I will investigate this with the Germans later this week, Philbin. I'm not... I don't have enough knowledge about German communist organisations to answer your question properly, but I will put it to the German comrades when they come on. Unused sub says, saludos from Alicante, comrades. What is the difference between the Communist Party of Britain and the Communist Party of Great Britain? Which is the descendant of the pre-91 party? Right, Communist Party of Britain is the official descendant of the pre-91 party. The party of which I am a proud member of is the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And they are the descendants of an anti-revisionist tradition in Britain. And they weren't part of the old CPGB. Ben says, a point that can bring petty bourgeois farmers on board is policy of self-reliance and socialist patriotism, putting domestic production at the heart of the planned economy, giving them security. And this is what we've been talking about. Ben is completely correct on that point. James Graham, Z to you as well. Mallard, okay, well, we're in full agreement then, if you agree with the point I was making there. Okay, right. Going to be bringing it to a close for this evening now. Thank you to everybody who has contributed to the chat this evening. It's been a most interesting discussion. I'll be back again tomorrow, and I'm going to look into the state of emergency in Ecuador. Sounds like something very strange is going on there. And any questions on this, feel free to drop them into the Telegram group, and I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he.